Okay, hello English Lit students. This is one of the key contexts for the Moonstone for paper 2. And it's about the crime in the 19th century. Okay, so just a quick, before we get to the 19th century, what was sort of the reaction to crime and punishment in the 18th century and into the early 19th century? And it was pretty grim. The legal rules and punishments was known as the Bloody Code, so that gives you an idea of how gruesome it was. And it was pretty much based on revenge and deterrent. So put people off crime by making the punishments really gruesome, or just actually literally get revenge, you know, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth sort of idea. Disemboweling convicts while they were still alive wasn't actually abolished until 1806. Doesn't mean they were still doing it, but it was still in the statute books. Capital punishment for a wide range of petty crime was abolished in the 19th century, but before then, theft was punishable by death. So, you know, a whole range of crimes, not just murder. There were still public executions until the 1840s, and then people started campaigning against public execution. Not execution itself, but the fact that crowds would gather to watch people being executed. And public execution wasn't abolished until 1868. Okay. The Victorians, as we know, were very interested in moral reform and reforming society, and one of the areas that they were interested in reforming was prisons themselves and the prisoners within those prisons. So 19th century prison reformers wanted prisons to change, that prisons should be designed and run to reform prisoners. This is not just punishment, this is reform, make prisoners better and make them, you know, be fit to live in society afterwards. And they believed that prisoners could be reformed through hard work, reflection, and Christian teaching inside the prisons. And you can see the image there is of a very famous prison reformer called Elizabeth Fry. She was a Quaker, and she visited the prisons and went to teach them religion, but also to try and give them a better chance of life and to improve the conditions of what prisons were like. So increasingly in the 19th century, prisons were viewed as places where people could and should be reformed. And this is where you get the word the reformatory for the prison. And so as far as the Moonstone is concerned, remember this is where Rosanna is rescued from by Lady Verinder, from a reformatory. So how did fears and ideas of crime link to class and link to gender in the 19th century? One of the big areas that Victorians were very concerned about was the growing cities. And the growing cities were seen as nurseries of modern crime. And the nursery is a place where you learn to do something. So the city itself was implicated in crime in the 19th century. There was an awareness that extreme poverty nurtured crime in this underclass that was now drawn to the cities, living in really, really dire poverty. Middle classes were also suspicious of degenerate aristocrats, seen as lacking self-discipline or a sense of responsibility. Novelists and readers were often unwilling to accept the possibility of a gentlewoman being the perpetrator of crime, as in the real-life Constance Kent case, if you remember. We talked about that separately. That was the Roadhouse murder, where it was the young lady murdered her stepbrother. There was also in the 19th century the rise of white-collar crimes, such as fraud and forgery. This was distinctly 19th century. So if you think about the Moonstone, we have Rosanna clearly coming from the city. It's London, where she's been living in poverty and driven into crime through poverty. But we also have a evil aristocrat. Colonel Herncastle is the other side of this. He's the dissolute, immoral, violent aristocrat who's also a very serious criminal. And then with Godfrey Ablewhite, we have the white-collar criminal. He's a fraud and a forger. He's embezzled money from a will. He's forged signatures. And we also have in the Moonstone the fact that, you know, Collins does not make Rachel the perpetrator of crime, and makes it a sort of sign of the badness of characters if they can contemplate that she would commit such a crime. So the Moonstone is written against the emergence of police forces. This is a new phenomenon in the 19th century. In the early 19th century, London didn't have a police force. It had what were called constables, but they were not professional. Well, they were paid, but they were highly limited in what they could do, and night watchmen. People very early in the 19th century, there were people who thought we should have a police force, but it was very unpopular as a move. There was lots of opposition. People of all classes were suspicious of a police force, especially if it was armed. There were fears it could be used to suppress protest and to support military dictatorship. Paris in France had the best known, the best organised paid police force. At this point, Britain was at war with France, or had been at war with France, and was used to anti-French propaganda. So anything that came from France was seen as going to restrict people's liberty. The French state was seen as being, very oppressive, and we didn't want to be like the French. Nevertheless, a Metropolitan Police force was set up. Metropolitan means linked to the city, particularly the capital city. So this was just in London in 1829. They were meant to be disciplined, professional, and most importantly, preventative. Their aim was to prevent crime just by being around on the streets. They were responsible to the Home Secretary, Robert Peel, and this is where a couple of nicknames for police came from, both Bobbies from Robert and Peelers from Peel. And to make the public feel confident that they weren't military, they were not armed, and their uniform was designed not to look like a military uniform. It's interesting where they fit in the social scale. They were paid more than a labourer, but less than a skilled worker. So they were still very much a working class job. And some of them would work 7 days a week, walking their beat. They all had their beat to walk, and they just walked round and round it of 7 to 10 miles a day to earn, a decent wage for their job. It was another nearly 20 years before they actually created a detective force, the opposite of preventative, to actually detect what happened after a crime had been committed. And the reason a detective force was once again seen as a dangerous step is they were seen as being almost like government spies, that detectives were sort of underhand. They didn't wear uniform. They tried to figure out who'd been up to what. But that changed after there was an embarrassing murder case in which the suspect escaped, and the police were seen as being a bit bungling. So there was a detective department set up of the Metropolitan Police, and they investigated murder, fraud, theft, and they investigated suspicious persons, of which London had many. There were not very many restrictions on people coming to Britain from abroad. So lots of people who were exiles for political reasons would leave Italy, Germany, places like that. So anarchists, Republicans, all sorts of people. Detectives' job was to get to know the criminal element. So they would hang out in pubs and at horse races. They used informers, and they would also read newspapers to try and get information. Now, like Sergeant Cuff, they undertook work for the Home Office, but they could also undertake work for private individuals and institutions and for local magistrates. So not like detective force today, they could freelance a bit if someone wanted to. So in the Moonstone, we see a very new phenomenon in British society, the detective. The image of the detective was just forming at this point. And Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens, who were friends, fellow writers, they worked together on Dickens's publication. It was a magazine called The Household Words, and Dickens would interview the detectives. He thought they were fascinating. He praised them. He said, if thieving be an art, thief-taking is a science. So that's another word for a detective, a thief-taker. And detective based the Inspector Bucket in his novel Bleak House on the real detective, Frederick Field. And Dickens is seen as being responsible for changing the image of detectives. Fictional detectives were often portrayed as intelligent, thoughtful, judicious men with a touch of mystery about them. And I want you to think about how those terms relate to Sergeant Cuff. This positive portrayal may have contributed to the change in the way educated Britons perceived centralised policing by the second half of the 19th century, which is the point at which the Moonstone is published, 1868. Now, the other part of crime and detection that we get in the Moonstone and developing in the 19th century is forensic methods. The Moonstone demonstrates the emergence of forensic science and its growing importance to the new science called criminology. Forensic science refers to applying scientific techniques to evidence in criminal cases. And there are a couple of real-life historical examples of forensic science at the time. In 1858, Sir James Herschel, who was a magistrate in the British Empire in India, he was the chief magistrate in Yongipur, he took an existing Indian method where they would use palm prints and fingerprints to sign documents, because you could check that it was a person from that evidence, and they started using them, and then they started using them to register and identify criminals. And that was used by Sir Edward Henry, who was the Inspector General of Bengal. So, rather dodgily, it's being used by the British Empire to impose its rule and to keep its eyes on people in India who they called criminals, and they could, if they caught them again, they could check who they were by their and their palm prints. Criminology is the scientific study of crime, and this only starts in the 19th century. It's a new discipline. Some of it is still what we'd recognise as science, some of it is what we would call pseudoscience, i.e. not really science, a bit of mumbo jumbo. Human physiology and social prejudice. So phrenology is a pseudoscience. It claimed that the shape of your head could reveal facts about your character and how moral you were, how big your forehead was, for example. I often tell you about that. And there was an Italian called Lombroso who claimed to have identified physical characteristics of the criminal. And this mixed the theory of evolution, which was big and new at the time, with social behaviour. So he established the idea of the criminal type. It's crudely influenced by Darwin. Literally, do you have features that look to me like those of an ape? Therefore, you must be a criminal. So a heavy forehead, big brows, receding chin. These things, not by chance, tied into different racial types that the Victorians thought were dodgy people anyway. Mediterranean people, Romany people, non-white Anglo-Saxon people. So Ezra Jennings, we can think about in The Moonstone as being like a forensic investigator. He's an expert on the physiological basis of behaviour, and he's fictionally the author of a controversial text on the functioning of the nervous system. So just like a forensic investigator, he possesses specialised knowledge and he's committed to scientific theory. He proposes a bold experiment, which is re-establishing Franklin Blake's night when the jewel is stolen, giving him the opium, seeing what happens. It's rigorously scientific, and according to the novel, it's based on recent research and theory in forensic medicine. And Collins has Ezra Jennings talk about two real authors. So Dr. Carpenter and Dr. John Elliotson, these are real authors, real scientists of real books. And Ezra Jennings solves the mystery. His experiment shows that Blake had acted under this influence of chemical stimulants, physiological drives, and nervous impulses.